over, but rather they were wrested from what was then the world's greatest superpower in a long and bloody war that devastated many of the colonies and left many of the founders and many of the signers of the Declaration broke, imprisoned, or both. This was a war initially carried out by a ragtag, underfed militia made up of men who picked up their own privately owned weapons and took on the most powerful army in the world. In fact, the history books today barely mention what was once known as, when I was in school, the shot heard around the world. The conflict at Lexington Green and Concord Bridge that launched a revolution that brought freedom to a nation and then to a continent and then within 150 years half the world. None of the history books that I've seen tell why it was that the British were going to Lexington and Concord. They were going to confiscate the colonists' weapons. Tyrants have always known that an armed populace cannot be enslaved. This, then, is the history of how we got our Constitution. The question now is just what does it do? The quick and short answer is this. It protects us by restricting the power of government. It does this in three ways, folks. One, by dividing power between the government, the states, and we, the people. From the long European experience, the founders feared more than anything centralized government and sought to diffuse power as much as possible down to the lowest, most local level so people could have as much say as possible. And by dividing the federal government into three branches, they sought further to diffuse the federal government's power by creating checks and balances, which sadly no longer exist. And finally, and most importantly, by providing to us a Bill of Rights that was supposed to be inviolate and unrestricted by the government, the most important of which were the First and Second Amendments. I have often explained to my children that the First Amendment is like the brain and the mouth of the body of freedom. It guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, like we're doing today, freedom of religion, and the freedom to petition our government. The Second Amendment is the muscle of the body of freedom. Folks, it's the right to keep and bear arms, and it has to do with just one thing: the ability to overthrow the government if it becomes oppressive. Let me once again quote from the Declaration of Independence that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, protecting freedom, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. And how did our founders do it? By force of arms. One of the most important and ignored sections of the Constitution is the 10th Amendment, which, folks, says that if it doesn't specifically say the federal government has a power, if it's not specifically named in the Constitution, then it has no right being involved. Those powers are reserved to the people. Now, sadly, our Constitution is under grave threat as we stand here today. It's not my intention to be partisan, folks. I could go back 6 years, and I'm sure many of you could too, and tick off unconstitutional act after unconstitutional act by Republican presidents, Democrat presidents, Republican Congresses, Democrat Congresses over the last 16 years. But I am going to focus on what's happening now because that is the imminent threat to us today. It may surprise you to find out that the branch of government most responsible for protecting our rights is, in fact, the greatest threat to our Constitution, the federal court system. Our federal court system is laced with activist judges who don't believe the Constitution says what the founders meant it to say, but rather what they think it should say. Folks, the Constitution is supposed to restrict the government. If the government decides they can make it say something else, then it is meaningless. But that is by far not the only threat that we face. Our freedom is under attack from a president who famously said he wants to, quote, spread the wealth. Well, I'm here to tell you there is no clause in the Constitution that empowers our government to take one American's property and give it to another. Founders understood clearly that the key to prosperity was using government to protect equal rights, not provide equal things. Thomas Jefferson said that the government that's big enough to give you everything is strong enough to take everything. Our First Amendment, one of the most precious of all, is threatened now on several fronts. There's a movement afoot in Congress to shut down talk radio. It's been proposed to give the president the power and authority to shut down the internet. These are direct attacks on freedom of the press, freedom of the speech, our way of providing information to each other. Congressional leaders have called people like you Nazis, mobsters, un-American, in an attempt to chill freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. The White House has set up a website asking us to turn in our neighbors who speak out against the president or his agenda. Folks, this happened in Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia, not in the United States.